In 2023, the global standard across, well, nearly every international metric is that women's economic and social development trails behind men's. I mean, that is just the baseline reality we are so used to seeing in global data, right?
Right, absolutely. It's almost baked into how we read these reports.
Exactly. But today, we're looking at this massive 30-year stack of research on the Dominican Republic. And right at the top of page 1, there is a statistic that looks, honestly, mathematically impossible.
The Gender Development Index score.
Yes, the GDI. According to the data, female human development in the Dominican Republic isn't just catching up to male development. It is actively beating it. They score a 1.024 on the index.
Which is a number that completely subverts our usual expectations of demographic data. To give you some context, any score over exactly 1.0 on this index means women have actually surpassed men in the foundational metrics of human development.
Wow.
Yeah, and in fact, just a couple of years ago in 2021, the Dominican Republic was ranked number 2 in the entire world for this specific measurement.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you see a nation sitting in what the UN calls Group 1 for gender parity, your first instinct is to think, they have solved the inequality puzzle.
Sure, you assume a woman in Santo Domingo has unprecedented economic and social power.
Right. But today, we're looking at decades of data, going from 1990 all the way to 2023, to figure out if that 1.024 is a miracle, or if it's, well, an illusion.
And that is exactly the mission for this deep dive, because what's fascinating here is the friction between potential and reality.
The friction, I like that.
Yeah, we have this one index, the Gender Development Index, painting a picture of female dominance. But when you cross-reference that with the country's Gender Inequality Index, which measures actual power, agency, and representation.
The reality check.
Exactly. The Dominican Republic ranks 111th globally on that one. That puts them squarely in the bottom 40% of the world.
It's a massive paradox. How can a country be like top 10 in the world for female development, but bottom half of the world for female equality?
It really is wild when you look at it on paper.
To figure that out, we are going to trace a 30-year economic transformation. We need to look at the mechanics of how a country gets richer, how it educates its citizens, and what happens to the physical health of its people along the way.
And then we are going to look at the hidden bottlenecks, the structural barriers that prevent that human potential from turning into real-world power.
So to really understand this gender paradox, I guess we have to start by looking at the canvas it is painted on.
Right. Before we even begin to split the data between men and women, we need to establish how fast the Dominican Republic is moving as a whole entity. We need to look at their Human Development Index, or HDI.
And for you listening, think of the HDI not just as an acronym, but as a composite snapshot of a nation's baseline capability. It measures health, wealth, and wisdom.
A very clean way to put it.
Thanks. And the trajectory here is relentless. Back in 1990, the Dominican Republic's HDI was 0.59, which the UN classifies as medium development.
Right.
But by 2023, that number had climbed to 0.776, pushing them solidly into the high development category. That's a 31.7% increase.
And that upward slope is vital to understand. In 2023, the world average HDI was 0.756. So the Dominican Republic is consistently outperforming the global average.
They're sitting at 93rd out of 203 tracked countries and territories right now.
Exactly. But moving from medium to high development is one of the hardest transitions a nation can make. Economists often talk about the middle income trap.
Where a country gets to a certain level of basic industrialization and then just sort of stagnates.
Yeah, because the low-hanging fruit is gone. You can't just build a few basic factories and expect the numbers to keep rising indefinitely.
You need a fundamentally different engine.
Precisely. Breaking through that ceiling requires synchronized, compounding improvements across multiple sectors of society all at once.
So you need a public health apparatus that keeps people alive longer, an education system that fundamentally changes how people think, and an economic engine that scales up purchasing power.
Yes. And if any one of those 3 pillars crumbles, the whole index stalls out.
So let's pull apart those 3 pillars to see how they actually did it, starting with the most fundamental requirement, keeping citizens alive.
You cannot accumulate wealth or knowledge if your population is dying young.
Exactly. So we look at life expectancy at birth.
The foundational biological metric.
The 2023 data puts the overall life expectancy for someone born in the Dominican Republic at 73.7 years. That's a solid number, sitting just a fraction above the global average of 73.4 years.
It shows a highly functional, resilient public health baseline. And we can actually see that resilience tested in the data.
Oh, you mean the pandemic?
Yeah. If you look at the timeline around 2021, the overall life expectancy takes a severe hit, dropping down to roughly 71.7 years.
It's wild how you can see a global historical event just carve a canyon into a demographic spreadsheet.
It really is. It erased years of incremental public health gains in a matter of months. But the critical takeaway from the data isn't the drop itself, it's the rebound.
The bounce back.
Right. By 2022, the life expectancy aggressively bounced back to 74.2 years. That kind of V-shaped recovery in population health tells you that the underlying medical infrastructure, the ability to mobilize resources, distribute treatments, and manage a crisis, is fundamentally sound.
Okay, the baseline is sound. But here's where it gets really interesting and where we get our first major clue to our paradox.
The gender split.
Yes. When you take that 73.7-year average and split it by gender, a massive canyon opens up. Females born in the Dominican Republic are expected to live to 77.0 years.
And males?
Males are expected to live to just 70.5 years.
Wow.
That is a 6.5-year gap. Women are living nearly 7 years longer.
Yeah.
But I want to push back on this a bit because we just established that the country went through a massive 30-year economic boom.
Sure.
If the economy quadrupled, shouldn't modernization and automation have made male-dominated jobs safer? Why is the gap still 6.5 years wide after 3 decades of development?
It's an excellent question, and it speaks to the mechanics of how developing economies actually function on the ground.
Right.
You are entirely correct that globally, women have a biological survival advantage. But a 6.5-year gap is extreme. And ironically, rapid economic development can actually exacerbate male mortality in the short to medium term.
Wait, really? How does getting richer make men die younger?
Well, think about what physical changes happen when a country moves from medium to high development.
Is it building stuff?
Exactly. You have massive urbanization. You have a sudden explosion of infrastructure projects, building highways, bridges, power grids, high-rise commercial real estate.
And those are overwhelmingly male jobs.
Yes, highly hazardous, labor-intensive sectors overwhelmingly populated by men. Furthermore, as purchasing power increases, you see an influx of motor vehicles.
Motorcycles especially.
Especially motorcycles hitting roads where the traffic safety regulations and enforcement just haven't caught up to the volume of traffic.
So the infrastructure to buy the motorcycle outpaces the infrastructure to regulate the highway.
Exactly. You combine disproportionately high rates of traffic fatalities and occupational hazards with a global sociological trend where men are far less likely to utilize preventative health care.
Oh, right. The stubbornness factor.
Right. Often waiting until a condition is acute or catastrophic before seeing a doctor. And you get this persistent 6.5-year gap. Modernization doesn't automatically equal safety if the culture of labor and risk doesn't shift alongside it.
That makes perfect sense. And functionally, it means women are getting an extra 6.5 years to exist in society.
It's a massive advantage in human capital.
That is almost 7 extra years of accumulating experience, participating in the culture and influencing their families. But time alive is only step 1.
Right.
The next question is, what is the country doing to fill that time? How is it developing the minds of its citizens?
Which brings us to the second pillar, knowledge accumulation. And the data here illustrates a profound institutional leap.
So we're looking at 2 specific metrics here. First is the expected years of schooling, or EYS. This measures what a child entering the school system today can reasonably expect to receive.
And historically, this was pretty low.
Yeah. Back in 1990, the EYS was 9.3 years, so basically dropping out before finishing high school.
Right.
But by 2023, that number surged to 13.6 years.
That's the leap from a population that leaves school early to work in agriculture or basic manufacturing to a population that expects to complete secondary education and likely pursue some form of vocational or college training.
But the second metric is where the data gets truly fascinating. The mean years of schooling, or MYS.
This is the really stubborn metric.
Right, because this measures the actual realized education level of adults who are currently 25 years and older. In 1990, the adult average was just 5.3 years of schooling, barely a primary education.
Just a few years in a classroom.
But by 2023, it was 9.4 years.
I want to emphasize how incredibly difficult it is to move the mean years of schooling metric.
Why is that?
Because, unlike the expected years for a child, the MYS is a massive, slow-moving average of the entire adult population. It includes the 25-year-olds and the 85-year-olds.
Oh, yeah.
To raise that number by over 4 years requires an entire generational turnover. You are waiting for older, less formally educated cohorts to frankly, pass away, and younger, highly educated cohorts to cross that 25-year age threshold.
Right. It's like trying to turn a supertanker around.
Exactly.
Which is why I was staring at the timeline for this specific data point, and I noticed something incredibly strange. The adult average is inching up slowly over the decades. It goes from 7.3 to 7.4, then maybe 7.5. It's moving exactly as slowly as you'd expect.
The supertanker.
Yeah. And then, suddenly, in 2016, the data just spikes. The average jumps from around 7.7 years nationally straight up to 9.2 years. That happens almost overnight.
It's a huge leap.
How does an entire country of adults suddenly gain over a year of formal education in a single calendar year? I mean, did everyone just go back to night school?
No. That is what demographers call a statistical harvest, and it is a perfect example of how policy mechanics eventually show up in a CSV file.
A statistical harvest.
Yes. An abrupt leap like that in a slow-moving average isn't a demographic accident. It's an institutional intervention.
So they changed the rules of the game.
Exactly. When you see an anomaly like 2016, it usually represents the culmination of major systemic policy shifts. It could be that mandatory schooling laws passed 10 or 15 years prior finally hit critical mass.
Okay, so a massive group of students legally required to stay in school finally turned 25.
Exactly. And they entered the adult data set all at once. The seeds planted a decade ago finally bloomed in the spreadsheet.
That's fascinating.
It also heavily reflects changes in measurement and massive budget reallocations. If a government suddenly changes the legal definition of adult literacy or fundamentally revamps its vocational training certification to count as formal schooling years, you will see an immediate documented leap.
So they might have aggressively expanded rural school infrastructure in the late 2000s, subsidizing transport so teens wouldn't drop out.
Yes, and by 2016, that teenage cohort becomes the adult average.
I want you to just imagine the friction and the excitement of that transition for a moment. Think about a family where the parents spent maybe 5 years in a classroom, and their children are now consistently getting 13 years of education.
It's a completely different world.
It fundamentally changes the dinner table conversation. It changes the ambition of the household. It changes the types of businesses that get started and the kind of labor the population is willing to do.
And that societal shift leads us directly into the third pillar. Because when you massively expand the human capital of a population, when they live longer and get significantly more educated.
That knowledge is expected to translate into economic output.
Precisely. Let's look at the economic engine. We're tracking the gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
And the growth here is staggering. In 1990, the GNI per capita was $6,963. By 2023, it exploded to $22,024.
That is an income multiplication of approximately 216% over 30 years.
It's phenomenal. And again, just like with the life expectancy, you can clearly see the pandemic punch the economy in the gut. The GNI dropped from over $20,300 in 2019 down to roughly $18,729 in 2020.
A painful contraction.
But the V-shaped recovery was almost immediate. By 2021, it was back over $20,000 and just kept climbing.
But before we move on, we really need to clarify what these dollars actually mean. The data notes that this is measured in 2021 PPP dollars.
Why is that distinction so important?
Because if we just took local Dominican pesos and converted them to US dollars at a standard bank's exchange rate, the data would be functionally useless for measuring human development.
It wouldn't tell us how people actually live.
Exactly. PPP stands for Purchasing Power Parity. It anchors the money to reality.
Got it.
It measures the actual cost of living. PPP looks at a standardized basket of essential goods. So a certain amount of rice, the cost of keeping the lights on, basic housing, transportation, and it adjusts the income to reflect what that money can actually buy locally.
So when we say the income grew by 216% in PPP terms, we aren't just looking at inflation and we aren't looking at arbitrary currency fluctuations.
No, we are seeing a massive, tangible increase in the physical standard of living.
It means better roofing materials, more consistent caloric intake, and the sudden existence of disposable income for millions of people.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've established the macro reality. The Dominican Republic pulled off a 30-year miracle. They are living longer, they instituted massive educational reforms, and they quadrupled their purchasing power.
The baseline is incredibly strong.
Now, we are ready to cut this data in half by gender and solve the paradox we introduced at the top of the show.
Yeah.
Why are women mathematically winning the development race?
This is where we deconstruct that 1.024 Gender Development Index.
Right.
The math behind this number is fascinating because it reveals what the UN is actually prioritizing in its formulas.
So, as we mentioned, the Dominican Republic is in Group 1 for GDI.
Which is rare.
Very rare. The global average is 0.955, meaning globally, women's development trails men's development by about 4.5%.
Right.
But here, the women's overall HDI score is 0.773, which is higher than the men's score of 0.765. And when you look at the raw data, it comes down to two specific female advantages that are so overwhelmingly large, they mathematically erase the massive male advantage in income.
Let's break down the first advantage, the knowledge gap.
The education data is striking. Women in the Dominican Republic have a higher mean years of schooling than men. It's 9.9 years for women versus 9.0 years for men.
So the adult women are, on average, nearly a full year more formally educated than the adult men.
Exactly. But the expected years of schooling for the current generation is where the gap explodes. Girls entering the system today are expected to receive 14.6 years of education. Boys are expected to receive only 12.6 years.
That's a huge divergence.
Girls are staying in the classroom 2 full years longer.
And then you combine that educational dominance with the second advantage we've already unpacked, which is the biological and sociological lifespan gap.
Right. Women are living to 77.0 years, while men are living to 70.5.
So mechanically, here's what is happening in the UN spreadsheet. The men make vastly more money, and we'll get to exactly how much more in a second.
Oh, we will.
But when the GDI formula averages out the three pillars, the fact that women are living 6.5 years longer and getting up to 2 years more education creates a mathematical weight that pushes the female composite score above the male composite score.
The lifespan and the schooling completely overwhelm the paycheck.
Yes. But this brings us to the most critical analytical juncture of our deep dive. What is the GDI actually telling us?
Right.
The danger of looking at a 1.024 and celebrating it as gender parity is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the index measures.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The GDI is a measurement of human capital potential.
Potential, the raw materials,
No.
not the outcome.
Exactly. It measures the assets a human being possesses, their health, their time on Earth, and the knowledge in their brain.
It does not measure empowerment.
No. It does not measure systemic fairness. It does not measure agency. The women in the Dominican Republic have acquired an incredible amount of human capital.
But the vital question is, what happens when they attempt to deploy that capital?
Right. What happens when a highly educated woman, who is statistically likely to outlive her male peers, tries to enter the labor force or influence public policy or make decisions about her own body?
And that question shatters the illusion. Because the moment we shift from measuring potential to measuring agency, we hit the Gender Inequality Index, the GII.
And this is where the picture changes drastically.
As we said, the Dominican Republic's GII is 0.417, ranking them 111th in the world. So why is the inequality so severe?
Well, the GII is built on 3 different pillars: reproductive health, political empowerment, and economic reality. And when we examine these, we see the structural bottlenecks that trap all that female potential.
Let's start with the first pillar, reproductive health. The data here exposes a severe and persistent physical danger for women, regardless of their education levels.
It's sobering data.
It is. The maternal mortality ratio, or MMR, measures how many women die from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births. In the Dominican Republic, the MMR sits at an incredibly high 107.
To put that in perspective, that is a rate you would typically associate with a country struggling in the lower tiers of human development, not a nation that just quadrupled its income and boasts an HDI of 0.776.
But the most alarming part isn't just the raw number, it's the timeline. The data shows they were actually making progress.
Yes, and initially.
By 2015, the MMR had dropped to 98.8. They were bending the curve downward, but then it reversed. By 2020, it climbed back up to 107.3, and it has essentially stayed elevated through 2023.
That's a really troubling reversal.
How does a country get significantly richer but suddenly start losing more mothers in childbirth?
It points directly to a bottleneck in infrastructure scaling and quality control. We discussed how rapid economic growth drives urbanization, right?
Yeah, people moving to the cities for jobs.
Exactly. As populations flood into cities seeking those new higher-paying jobs, the demand on the urban hospital systems skyrockets. You can build a new maternity ward, but you cannot instantly train a decade's worth of highly specialized obstetricians and emergency neonatal nurses to staff it.
The human resources can't keep up with the concrete.
Right. Furthermore, severe income inequality means that while the average wealth of the nation is high, the women at the bottom of the economic ladder are navigating severely overcrowded, under-resourced public health facilities. The economic boom outpaced the capacity of the maternal safety net.
And alongside maternal mortality, the GII measures the adolescent birth rate, the ABR. This tracks births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19.
Another critical indicator of agency.
Now, the data here shows a massive historical drop. In 1990, it was 117.5. By 2023, it was cut by more than half, down to 52.7.
That halving is a clear sign of progress. It reflects better access to information and changing cultural norms.
What?
But an ABR of 52.7 is still a massive structural problem for a developing economy. It's still significantly higher than the global average.
Because it acts as a hard stop on human capital. If a 16-year-old girl gets pregnant, that beautiful statistic we talked about earlier, the 14.6 expected years of schooling, that just evaporates.
Precisely. Early childbearing profoundly disrupts the accumulation of knowledge.
It physically removes young women from the education system before they can earn the credentials needed to access the modern, high-paying sectors of the economy.
Exactly. It traps them in informal, low-wage labor, limiting their economic agency for the rest of their lives, regardless of how fast the national GDP is growing.
Which leads perfectly into the second pillar of inequality, political empowerment. This is where we measure who is actually writing the laws and controlling the budget.
Who actually holds the levers of power?
Right. We know the adult women have a higher mean years of schooling than the men. So from a pure human capital standpoint, you would expect them to be highly represented in the government.
But the data reveals a profound disconnect between educational credentials and political power.
The numbers are stark. Women hold only 25.7% of the parliamentary seats. Men hold absolute control at 74.3%.
So despite the fact that the female population has spent more time in formal educational institutions, the structural architecture of the society, the funding for those overcrowded maternity wards, the labor laws, the economic zoning.
It's overwhelmingly controlled by men.
Yes, the human capital is blocked from the halls of power.
And that political blockade trickles down to the third pillar, economic reality.
The labor market.
We talked about the gross national income exploding by 216%, but when we look at the labor force participation rate, we see exactly who is allowed to capture that wealth.
This is the real bottleneck.
Only 52.7% of women are actively participating in the labor force. Contrast that with the men, who are participating at a massive 76.9%.
That is a staggering inefficiency for the country.
Right.
You have a society that has invested massive resources into educating its women, keeping them in school for up to 14 years, and yet nearly half of that highly trained human capital is sitting completely outside the formal economic engine.
And for the 52.7% of women who do make it into the workforce, they hit a massive wage wall.
The income gap.
The estimated female GNI per capita is $17,367. The male GNI per capita is $26,730.
Let the friction of those numbers sink in.
Women are making just 65% of what men make.
Despite all the advantages we listed earlier.
They live 6.5 years longer. They stay in school up to 2 years longer. And their reward for all that accumulated human capital is a paycheck that is 35% smaller than their less educated male counterparts.
The data presents a glaring structural reality. The society has built a highly effective pipeline for developing female potential.
It ensures they survive childhood, it puts them in classrooms, and it protects their baseline health.
But the moment those women attempt to convert that potential into economic independence or political leadership, they hit systemic institutional walls.
It's the ultimate paradox. You can have a 1.024 on the Gender Development Index, but if you don't have agency, it's just a theoretical number.
Exactly.
And what's crucial to understand is that this level of inequality, whether it's gender-based or income-based, it isn't just a moral failing.
No, it has mathematical consequences.
It acts as a massive tangible drag on the entire nation's economy. It is a hidden tax on everyone.
And to measure the true cost of that hidden tax, the UN uses a brilliant metric called the Inequality-Adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
I like to think of the regular HDI as a measure of how much water is pouring into the nation's bucket. It tells you the total volume of health, wealth, and education flowing into the country.
Okay, I like this analogy.
But the IHDI measures the holes in the bottom of that bucket. It calculates how much of that development leaks out through the cracks of inequality before the average citizen can actually drink it.
That's a perfect mechanism to visualize it because the standard HDI of 0.776 is just an average, and averages are easily skewed by the extremes at the top.
Right.
The IHDI penalizes the overall score based on how unequally the achievements are distributed across the population. And when you apply that inequality penalty to the Dominican Republic, the reality is sobering,
Their score plummets by 18.3%.
dropping to a true level of 0.634.
18.3% of the nation's human development is just lost to friction. It pours right out of the bucket.
And the data breaks down exactly where those leaks are coming from. The largest hole in the bucket is sheer income inequality.
A massive 22.9% loss in the income dimension alone.
This confirms what we suspected. The 216% growth in GNI wasn't distributed evenly.
So a concentrated tier of the population captured a massive share of the wealth, while the bottom tier saw marginal gains.
Exactly. And the second largest leak is education inequality, causing a 14.6% loss.
So while the average years of schooling went up, there is still a massive divide between the educational elite in Santo Domingo and the rural populations.
Which brings us to the most granular look at the bottom tier of the society, the multidimensional poverty index, or MPI.
The MPI is fascinating because it doesn't just look at who is living on less than $2 a day. It looks at the physical realities of poverty.
Right, it looks at daily life. Are you cooking with dirty fuel? Do you have a dirt floor? Are your kids in school?
And the macro number here is actually a huge win for the Dominican Republic. Their overall MPI is incredibly low at 0.009. Extreme, overlapping, multidimensional poverty has been largely eradicated.
It is the ultimate proof that the 30-year economic engine did, in fact, lift the absolute baseline of the country.
But the data provides a pie chart that zooms in strictly on the small percentage of people who are still trapped in multidimensional poverty. And it tells us exactly what is holding them down.
It's very revealing.
Among the impoverished, 33.2% of their poverty is driven by a single factor: a lack of years of schooling. Another 9.8% is driven by inadequate housing materials, and 9.1% is driven by a lack of basic sanitation.
What is so powerful about this specific dataset is that it provides a literal instruction manual for policymakers.
How so?
Well, if a government wants to eradicate the final, stubborn pockets of extreme poverty, macroeconomic policies and broad cash transfers aren't going to be enough.
Handing out cash doesn't fix a lack of plumbing.
Exactly. The data shows exactly where to intervene. It requires highly targeted physical infrastructure projects.
You want to fix the MPI? Build a school in a rural village, put a solid roof on the houses, and install working plumbing. The blueprint is right there. Schools and toilets. That is how you close the final gap.
It's precision intervention.
So we've spent this deep dive exploring the human cost of this 30-year economic miracle. We've measured the inequality and the gender gaps. But before we conclude, there is one more dimension of development we must measure.
And it is entirely external.
What was the cost to the Earth?
Right, because historically, there has been a very dark equation in global development. To get rich, you have to burn carbon.
The industrial revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries were fueled by coal, oil, and ecological destruction.
So did the Dominican Republic destroy its local environment to achieve that 31.7% increase in HDI?
To answer that, the UN introduced the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or PHDI. It takes the standard development score and penalizes it based on the country's carbon dioxide emissions and material footprint per capita.
And the Dominican Republic's performance here is nothing short of incredible. Their PHDI score is 0.726.
Meaning, when you adjust their development for planetary pressure, their score only drops by 6.44%.
That is an astonishingly low penalty, especially for a nation that has experienced such rapid infrastructure expansion and urbanization.
The mechanics behind it are clear in the emissions data. Their carbon dioxide emissions are only 2.8 tons per capita.
To put that in perspective, the global average is 4.54 tons.
They have managed to radically scale up their population standard of living, push their expected schooling to over 13 years, and quadruple their income, all while keeping their carbon footprint dramatically below the world average.
It's a testament to highly efficient growth. They are expanding the economy without relying on the most toxic, carbon-heavy industrial practices.
And the result of this efficiency completely changes their standing on the global stage. This is my favorite statistic in the entire report.
Let's hear it.
We established earlier that their standard HDI rank is 93rd in the world. But when you apply the environmental lens, when you rank countries by the PHDI, the Dominican Republic shoots all the way up to 48th in the world.
A 45-place jump in the global rankings.
It proves that a developing nation in the 21st century does not have to follow the smog-filled, ecologically devastating path that Western nations took 100 years ago.
Green growth is not just a nice theory. It is mathematically viable and actively happening.
So if we synthesize all of these different indices, all the CSV files, and all the historical data points we've unpacked today, what is the ultimate blueprint for the Dominican Republic's future?
The academic researchers distill this massive data set down to 4 core recommendations.
First, they must consolidate the lead.
The gains made in female education and lifespans are historic. Keeping girls in school for 14.6 years is a monumental achievement.
But human capital is fragile.
Very fragile. The government must protect those educational pipelines and ensure there is no backsliding, particularly as the economy continues to recover and evolve post-pandemic.
Second, they have to urgently address the reproductive health bottlenecks. It is mathematically contradictory for a high HDI country to experience rising maternal mortality rates.
They must upgrade urban hospital capacities and maternal care network.
Third, they need to actively dismantle the glass ceiling. The society has successfully built the human capital. Now they have to unlock the agency.
That means aggressive policy interventions to close that massive 35% wage gap.
It means structural reforms to integrate that missing 24% of women into the formal labor force.
And it means creating pathways for women to break into the male-dominated parliament.
And finally, the fourth recommendation, lean into the green advantage.
A 48th place global ranking on the PHDI is a massive strategic asset.
The country should use that ecological efficiency as a magnet to attract international green investment, continuing to build a low-carbon, sustainable economy that outpaces older, heavier industrialized nations.
The blueprint is crystal clear.
Thank you so much for going on this intense data journey with us. We've looked at 30 years of growth, the resilience of life expectancy, the spike in education, and the hidden leaks in the economic bucket.
It's a lot of data, but it paints a vivid picture.
But I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. For decades, the global development community has operated on a core assumption. If you want to achieve gender equality, you have to educate girls.
Education is the ultimate equalizer.
That's the theory. But the Dominican Republic presents a fascinating, perhaps unsettling counter-narrative. The women there have secured the educational dominance. They are outschooling the men.
Yes, and outliving them.
Yet, they still face a 35% wage gap and hold only a quarter of the political power. If a society can enthusiastically educate its women without ever actually handing them the keys to the economy, does education alone actually create equality?
It's a profound question.
Or are global development initiatives pouring billions of dollars into the wrong side of the equation? Keep questioning the numbers, look for the friction in the data, and never assume the surface-level index is telling you the whole truth.